I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
The December snow fell with the persistence of an English winter determined to make its presence felt, transforming the Yorkshire countryside into a crystalline wilderness that stretched endlessly beneath leaden skies. My friend Colonel Archie Langford and I arrived at Frostbridge Manor as the afternoon light began its premature retreat, our motor car crunching through the pristine white carpet that had settled over the long gravel drive. I confess I had not anticipated finding myself in such distinguished company for the weekend, but when Langford mentioned that his wife's indisposition had left him with a spare invitation to witness the unveiling of the famous Frostbridge star, I found myself curious enough to accept. "You'll find it quite the gathering, Hastings," Langford had assured me during our journey. "Lady Margaret Ashworth has assembled quite the collection of personalities for this affair. The star itself is worth a king's ransom, a sapphire the size of a robin's egg, blue as heaven itself. She's determined to auction the thing for the local hospital, though I suspect the decision pains her considerably." Frostbridge Manor rose before us like something from a Gothic romance, its grey stone walls softened by centuries of ivy, and the gentle accumulation of snow upon its many gables and chimneys. Warm light spilled from mullioned windows, promising refuge from the bitter cold that seemed to penetrate even the thickest overcoat. As we alighted from the motor, I could not shake the impression that the ancient house was watching us, evaluating our worthiness to cross its threshold. The interior proved as magnificent as the exterior promised. We were received in a grand entrance hall dominated by a sweeping staircase and warmed by an enormous fireplace that could have accommodated a small tree. Our hostess, Lady Margaret Ashworth, greeted us with the practiced grace of one born to such surroundings. Though she must have been approaching 70, her bearing remained regal, her silver hair arranged with meticulous care beneath a simple but elegant diamond tiara. Her dark blue evening gown, while understated, spoke of impeccable taste and considerable expense. "Colonel Langford, how delightful," she said, extending a gloved hand. "And you must be Captain Hastings. I trust your journey was not too arduous despite the weather." "Not at all, Lady Margaret," I replied, genuinely charmed by her warmth. "The countryside is quite beautiful under its winter dress." "Indeed, though I fear we may find ourselves rather more isolated than originally planned. The meteorological reports suggest the snow will continue through the weekend. Still, there are worse fates than being snowbound with congenial company and a well-stocked cellar." As we were led into the blue drawing room, I found myself studying the assembled guests with the interest that had been sharpened by my association with Hercule Poirot. Experience had taught me that in gatherings such as this, beneath the veneer of polite society, currents of passion, greed, and resentment often flowed with dangerous intensity. The most immediately striking figure was Mr. Silas P. Crowther, an American industrialist whose presence seemed to fill whatever room he occupied. A man of perhaps 55, built like a prize fighter who had discovered the pleasures of excellent cuisine, he possessed the kind of aggressive confidence that had undoubtedly served him well in business. Diamond studs glittered in his evening shirt, and his thick fingers bore rings that would have funded a small expedition. When he spoke, which was frequently, his voice carried the unmistakable accent of New York's financial district. "Lady Margaret," he was saying as we entered, "you've got to understand that sentiment don't pay the bills. That sapphire of yours is going to fetch top dollar because it's got provenance, it's got beauty, and most importantly, it's got a story. Americans love a good story, especially one with a castle and a title attached." "I hardly think Frostbridge qualifies as a castle, Mr. Crowther," Lady Margaret replied with gentle amusement, "though I appreciate your enthusiasm for our little family heirloom." Near the fireplace stood a gentleman I recognized as Mr. Archibald Lenton, the family solicitor. A man of impeccable dress and careful manners, he possessed the sort of bland competence that inspired confidence in matters of business while revealing nothing of his personal character. His pale eyes moved constantly about the room, cataloguing details with the precision of a man accustomed to noting the significance of seemingly trivial matters. The younger members of the party provided a fascinating study in contrasts. Miss Lydia Quayle, introduced as Lady Margaret's companion and secretary, was a woman of perhaps 28, with the kind of quiet beauty that revealed itself gradually. Her dark hair was arranged simply, and her evening dress, while perfectly appropriate, lacked the costly elegance of the other ladies present. She moved through the room with the careful efficiency of one whose position depended upon anticipating the needs of others, yet I detected in her dark eyes an intelligence that suggested depths beyond her modest circumstances. Mr. Felix Ashworth, Lady Margaret's nephew and heir, presented quite a different picture. Handsome in the manner of a matinee idol, with golden hair and features that belonged on a classical statue, he possessed the easy charm of a man who had never been required to earn his way in the world. His evening clothes were perfectly tailored, and he wore them with the unconscious grace of breeding, yet there was something in his manner, a restlessness, perhaps, or a hint of desperation beneath the polished surface, that suggested all was not entirely well in his privileged existence. Miss Verity Vale, the celebrated actress, required no introduction even to one as removed from theatrical circles as myself. Her beauty was of the dramatic sort that commanded attention from across a crowded room, enhanced by skillful cosmetics and a gown of emerald silk that had undoubtedly cost more than many families earned in a year. She moved with the studied grace of one accustomed to being observed, yet I sensed in her frequent glances toward young Felix an intensity that suggested her interest in the Ashworth family extended beyond mere social acquaintance. Dr. Lionel Hawkes, the local physician, provided a welcome note of professional sobriety to the gathering. A man of middle years with a kind of steady, reassuring presence that inspired confidence in times of crisis, he seemed content to observe the social dynamics around him with the detached interest of one who had witnessed human nature in all its manifestations. His conversation, when he contributed to it, revealed both intelligence and discretion, qualities that had undoubtedly served him well in his practice. The remaining guests completed what Poirot would have recognized as a classic closed circle of suspects, though at that moment such thoughts were far from my mind. Mrs. Adela Carstairs, a sharp-featured woman of uncertain years, who had traveled from Bath for the occasion, possessed the kind of penetrating gaze that suggested she missed very little of what transpired around her. Mr. Julian Hargrave, a distant cousin with dark good looks, somewhat marred by an air of barely suppressed anxiety, seemed perpetually on the verge of saying something significant, though he consistently thought better of it at the last moment. The Reverend Simon Bletchley, a small, precise man with the earnest manner of one who genuinely believed in the fundamental goodness of humanity, provided a moral anchor to the gathering, though I suspected his faith in human nature might be severely tested before the weekend's end. Finally, there was Mr. Merton, the butler, whose dignified bearing and obvious competence suggested that Frostbridge Manor was fortunate indeed in its staff. At the center of all attention, displayed in a locked glass case upon an ornate table, lay the object that had drawn us all together, the Frostbridge star. Even from across the room, the sapphire's beauty was undeniable. It seemed to capture and concentrate the light from the chandelier above, transforming it into something deeper and more mysterious. The gem was perhaps 3 inches in length, cut in an unusual elongated oval that enhanced its natural brilliance, and set in a collar of diamonds that served only to emphasize its extraordinary color. A blue so pure and deep it seemed to contain the essence of twilight skies and midnight seas. Magnificent, isn't it? Felix Ashworth appeared at my elbow, following my gaze to the display case. Been in the family for over 2 centuries. Came from India originally, part of some Maharaja's collection. My great-great-grandfather acquired it during his service with the East India Company, though the exact circumstances have always been rather vague. It's certainly impressive, I agreed. I can understand why Mr. Crowther is so enthusiastic about its prospects at auction. Felix's expression darkened slightly. Yes, well, needs must when the devil drives, as they say. The estate requires considerable work, and modern death duties have rather depleted the family coffers. Aunt Margaret is being tremendously practical about the whole thing, though I know it breaks her heart to part with it. As the evening progressed toward the formal unveiling ceremony, I found myself increasingly aware of the undercurrents of tension that flowed beneath the surface of polite conversation. Miss Quayle's eyes followed Felix with an intensity that suggested emotions deeper than mere professional concern. Mr. Crowther's boisterous confidence seemed to grate upon several of the English guests, particularly Mr. Lenton, who winced visibly at the American's more colorful expressions. Mrs. Carstairs whispered frequent observations to whoever would listen, her sharp eyes missing nothing of the social dynamics around her. At precisely 8 o'clock, Lady Margaret called for attention. The assembled guests gathered around the display case as Mr. Merton stepped forward with the key, his movements possessed of the ceremonial gravity befitting such an occasion. "My dear friends," Lady Margaret began, her voice carrying easily through the suddenly quiet room, "it gives me great pleasure to share with you this evening the Frostbridge Star in what will be its final appearance in this house. For more than 200 years, it has been the pride of our family, but times change, and with them, our responsibilities. The proceeds from its sale will ensure that Frostbridge Manor continues to serve future generations while providing much-needed support for our local hospital. I hope you will find it as beautiful as I have always believed it to be." Mr. Merton inserted the key into the lock with practiced precision, lifting the glass lid to reveal the sapphire in all its glory. The assembled guests pressed closer, murmuring appreciatively at the gem's extraordinary beauty. Mr. Crowther produced a jeweler's loupe and bent to examine the stone more closely, nodding with evident satisfaction. "Flawless," he announced. "Absolutely flawless. Lady Margaret, you've got yourself a genuine treasure here. This is going to cause quite a sensation in New York." It was at that moment that the lights failed. The transition from bright illumination to complete darkness was so sudden and absolute that for several seconds no one moved or spoke. Then came the inevitable sounds of confusion, a feminine gasp, the scrape of a chair, someone's muttered oath. Mr. Merton's voice cut through the darkness with calm authority. "Please remain where you are, ladies and gentlemen. Mrs. Prout will have the emergency lamps lit momentarily. The electrical system has been somewhat unreliable since the storm began." True to his word, within moments, the warm glow of oil lamps began to dispel the darkness as the household staff moved with practiced efficiency. The electric lights flickered back to life shortly thereafter, revealing the guests blinking and adjusting to the restored illumination. It was Miss Quayle who first noticed what the darkness had concealed. "The star!" she cried, pointing toward the display case with a trembling hand. "It's gone!" Indeed, the velvet-lined case stood empty, the sapphire having vanished as completely as if it had never existed. The guests stared in stunned silence at the vacant space where, moments before, the Frostbridge Star had blazed with captured light. "Impossible," Mr. Lenton breathed. "The case was locked, and Mr. Merton has the only key." "I have my key," Mr. Merton confirmed, producing it from his waistcoat pocket. "Lady Margaret, do you have yours?" Lady Margaret's face had gone quite pale, but her voice remained steady. "It should be on my chatelaine," she said, lifting the ornate chain that hung from her waist. The small collection of keys that normally dangled there was intact, but as she examined them more closely, her expression grew troubled. "The case key is missing. The ribbon has been cut." Before anyone could respond to this alarming discovery, a new voice joined the conversation, a voice that spoke from the doorway leading to the long gallery, trembling with shock and fear. "Please," Miss Quayle called from the threshold, her face white as the snow outside. "Please come quickly. Something terrible has happened." We followed her in a confused rush through the gallery, past portraits of long-dead Ashworths whose painted eyes seemed to watch our passage with disapproval. At the far end, near the French doors that opened onto the snow-covered terrace, a dark shape lay crumpled upon the Persian carpet. It was Mr. Silas P. Crowther, and he was quite obviously dead. Dr. Hawkes was beside the body almost immediately, his professional instincts overriding the shock that had frozen the rest of us. After a brief examination, he looked up with a grave expression. "Stabbed," he announced simply. "Through the heart. Death would have been instantaneous." "Good God," Colonel Langford whispered beside me. Someone had moved to the French doors, which stood slightly ajar despite the bitter cold outside. Through the gap, we could see the terrace, its pristine snow surface marred by a confused pattern of footprints leading away into the darkness of the gardens beyond. "The doors are unlocked," Mr. Lenton observed, his legal training asserting itself even in the face of such horror. "The killer must have escaped that way." But it was Lady Margaret who made the observation that would prove most significant. She had knelt beside Dr. Hawkes and was examining Mr. Crowther's clenched fist with the detached curiosity of one too well bred to succumb to hysteria. "Doctor," she said quietly, "would you be so kind as to open his hand?" With gentle care, Dr. Hawkes pried open the dead man's fingers. Nestled in his palm was a small brass key attached to a length of blue ribbon, the missing key to the display case. "He took the star," Mrs. Carstairs said with grim satisfaction. "Stole it and tried to escape, but someone caught him." Mr. Merton moved to secure the French doors, turning the lock with a decisive click. "The telephone lines are down," he announced after checking the instrument in the hall. "We're completely cut off until the storm passes." As I stood there in that elegant gallery, surrounded by the shocked faces of our fellow guests and the still form of the man who had been so vibrantly alive only minutes before, I found myself thinking of my friend Hercule Poirot. How often had he told me that the most obvious solution was rarely the correct one? How frequently had he demonstrated that human nature was far more complex than it appeared on the surface? The snow continued to fall outside, sealing us within Frostbridge Manor with a murderer among our number. Somewhere in this house of secrets and shadows, someone had committed the perfect crime, or so they believed. But as I looked around at the assembled faces, noting the expressions of shock, fear, and in one or two cases, something that might have been calculation, I knew that perfection was an illusion that would not survive the scrutiny of the little Belgian detective's remarkable mind. If only Poirot were here, I thought. But then, as the implications of our situation became clear, I realized that before this weekend was over, his presence might be the only thing standing between justice and the triumph of a clever and ruthless killer. The game, as he would have said, was afoot. The immediate aftermath of discovering Mr. Crowther's body revealed the true character of each member of our party with startling clarity. Lady Margaret, despite the shock of finding murder committed under her own roof, maintained the composure that generations of breeding had instilled in her, though I noticed her hands trembled slightly as she directed Mr. Merton to ensure all external doors were properly secured. "We must keep our heads," she said with quiet authority. "Dr. Hawkes, is there anything further to be done for poor Mr. Crowther?" Dr. Hawkes, having covered the body with a sheet from the nearby linen closet, shook his head gravely. "Nothing can be done now, I'm afraid. The wound was precise, delivered by someone who knew exactly what they were doing." He glanced toward the French doors, now firmly locked. "As for those footprints in the snow, the continuing fall has already begun to obscure them." Colonel Langford, recovering his military bearing, stepped forward. "Then we must secure the scene and ensure no one else comes to harm. Lady Margaret, with the telephone lines down and roads impassable, we're completely isolated until this storm passes." The implications hung heavy in the air. Miss Verity, Vale, had sunk into one of the gallery's antique chairs, her dramatic beauty rendered even more striking by genuine pallor. Felix Ashworth hovered nearby with obvious concern, though his attention seemed divided between the actress and frequent glances toward Miss Quayle, who stood frozen near the French doors. "This is absolutely ghastly," Mrs. Carstairs declared with morbid fascination. "Mark my words, this Crowther fellow was probably involved with criminals. These Americans often have questionable associates." Mr. Lenton cleared his throat diplomatically. "I think we should avoid speculation. The facts seem clear enough." Mr. Crowther took the star and was confronted while attempting to escape. "But who could have followed him so quickly?" Miss Quayle asked, her voice steady despite underlying tension. "The lights were only out for minutes." Before anyone could respond, the sound of the front doorbell echoed through the house, startling us all. Moments later, Mr. Merton appeared with a small, dapper gentleman who shook snow from his hat with apologetic precision. His mustaches were as exact as a mathematical diagram, and his bright, intelligent eyes took in our scene with one comprehensive glance. "Madame," he said, bowing to Lady Margaret, "I am Hercule Poirot. I regret that I arrive at such an unfortunate moment." "Poirot!" I exclaimed, relief flooding through me. "How on earth?" Lady Margaret answered before I could finish. "I asked Mr. Lenton to consult Monsieur Poirot several days ago, Captain Hastings. When word of the auction spread, we received some rather unpleasant letters. I thought it prudent to seek professional advice. We expected him on the earlier train, but the storm delayed his arrival." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "You were wise to be cautious, Lady Margaret. Now, if you permit, I should like to examine the scene before anything is disturbed further." He approached the covered body with careful steps that avoided disturbing the carpet's patterns. After a brief examination, he studied the French doors and noted the small puddle of melted snow on the parquet floor. "The doors were open for some time," he murmured. "Yet the fire burned strong. The draught is recent." He examined the brass key in the dead man's palm, then compared it with the frayed ribbon on Lady Margaret's chatelaine. "Interesting. The cut here is neat, precise. But on your ribbon, madame, it is jagged, torn in haste." Dr. Hawkes nodded approvingly. "You have a keen eye, Monsieur Poirot. I noticed the wound was delivered with considerable force, suggesting either great passion or cold calculation." Poirot's gaze moved to Crowther's patent leather shoes. Wet snow on the edges, but not pressed into the treads. He approached the doors from inside, but did not venture onto the terrace. He gestured toward the confused footprints visible beyond the glass. "Yet someone wished us to believe otherwise. See how the snow has been swept. 2. Convenient, these tracks leading away." Felix Ashworth stepped forward, his face strained. "Are you suggesting the footprints were deliberately created to mislead us?" "I suggest nothing yet, monsieur. But I observe that someone has taken great care to present us with a particular story, one they very much wish us to believe." Poirot's eyes moved thoughtfully over each face in turn. "The question we must ask ourselves is this: why would someone work so hard to convince us that a thief escaped into the storm when the evidence suggests something quite different occurred within these walls?" The wind howled around Frostbridge Manor's ancient stones, and I realized that our weekend gathering had transformed into something far more sinister than any of us had anticipated. The weight of Poirot's words settled over our assembled company like the snow accumulating beyond the windows. I watched as faces that had moments before displayed only shock and confusion now showed the first stirrings of suspicion and fear. The realization that one among us was a murderer had transformed the elegant drawing room into something far more sinister. "Now then," Poirot continued, positioning himself beside the empty display case with the precision of a conductor preparing his orchestra, "we must establish the facts with mathematical exactitude. Each person will tell me precisely what they did during those 3 minutes of darkness. Lady Margaret, if you please." Lady Margaret straightened in her chair, her breeding asserting itself even under such extraordinary circumstances. I remained exactly where I stood when the lights failed. I called for Mr. Merton to bring lamps, and I did not move until illumination returned. And you, Mr. Lenton? The solicitor adjusted his spectacles nervously. I was perhaps 4 feet to the left of the display case. I heard movement, a chair scraping, someone's sharp intake of breath. I remained stationary throughout. Poirot's keen gaze moved methodically around the room. Miss Vale? I'm afraid I gasped rather loudly, she admitted with a tremulous smile. Sudden darkness has always unsettled me terribly. Felix, Mr. Ashworth, steadied me with his hand. Ah, so you moved, Monsieur Felix. Felix's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Only a step or two toward Miss Vale. Nothing more. Miss Quayle. The young woman's voice remained steady despite the pallor of her complexion. I stood behind Lady Margaret. When the lights returned and we discovered the theft, I felt a distinct draught from the direction of the long gallery. That is why I went to investigate. A draught, Poirot murmured thoughtfully. Most observant. And you, Mrs. Carstairs? I remained in my chair throughout the entire ordeal, she declared with brittle dignity. I am not one to stumble about in the dark like some frightened schoolgirl. The questioning continued with methodical precision, each response noted with the care of a botanist, cataloguing specimens. Mr. Hargrave claimed to have heard a door click during the darkness. The Reverend Bletchley admitted to feeling quite helpless without illumination. Dr. Hawkes had moved toward where he remembered the light switches being located. When the formal questioning concluded, Poirot moved to examine the French doors once more, his small figure bent in concentration as he studied details invisible to the rest of us. After several minutes, he straightened with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Most illuminating, he announced. The physical evidence tells us a story quite different from the one our murderer intended. Observe, if you will, the pattern of melted snow upon the floor. It forms not the random puddle one would expect from doors opened in haste, but rather a precise arc. The mark of doors opened deliberately and held at a specific angle. He gestured toward the curtain beside the French doors, and here, caught in the fabric, we find ash of a particular type. Not the coal ash from the gallery fireplace, but the finer ash from wood, ash that comes from the drawing-room hearth. Someone has been very busy with a brush, creating those convenient footprints we observed earlier. Felix shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Surely you're not suggesting someone deliberately created false evidence? I am suggesting precisely that, monsieur. Consider the sequence of events our murderer wishes us to accept. Mr. Crowther steals the star during the blackout, attempts to escape through the French doors, and is killed by an unknown accomplice who then flees into the storm. But this narrative contains a fatal flaw. Poirot paused, allowing the tension to build before delivering his conclusion. The theft and the murder did not occur simultaneously. The star was indeed taken during those 3 minutes of darkness, but Mr. Crowther was killed later, after we had all discovered the empty case, during the confusion that followed. Someone used our shock and distraction to slip away, confront the unfortunate American, and stage an elaborate deception. The silence that followed was profound. I could hear the wind howling around the manor's ancient stones and the soft hiss of coal settling in the fireplace. Mrs. Carstairs pressed her handkerchief to her lips, while Miss Vale gripped Felix's arm with white-knuckled intensity. "But who?" Lady Margaret asked quietly. "And why kill poor Mr. Crowther if he wasn't the thief?" Poirot's smile held no warmth whatsoever. "Ah, madame, that is indeed the question, but I suspect Mr. Crowther discovered something or someone that made him dangerous to our murderer. Perhaps he saw who really took the star. Perhaps he recognized the true motive behind this elaborate charade." He moved toward the door with purposeful stride. "I shall now speak with each of you individually. The truth, mes amis, has a way of emerging when examined under the proper light." Lady Margaret graciously offered the use of her private study for Poirot's interviews, a comfortable chamber lined with leather-bound volumes and warmed by a steady fire that cast dancing shadows across the Persian carpet. I positioned myself discreetly in a corner chair, notebook at the ready, as Poirot arranged his makeshift court with characteristic precision. A chair positioned exactly opposite his own, a small table cleared for his notes, and the fire adjusted to provide optimal illumination without creating distracting shadows. "Lady Margaret, if you would be so kind," Poirot began as our hostess entered with the dignified composure that had carried her through decades of social obligation. Despite the evening's shocking events, she maintained her regal bearing, though I noticed a slight tremor in her hands as she settled into the chair. "Madame," Poirot continued with gentle courtesy, "earlier you mentioned receiving unpleasant correspondence regarding the star. I must ask you to be most specific about these communications." Lady Margaret's expression grew troubled. "They began approximately 6 weeks ago, shortly after the auction announcement appeared in the Times. Anonymous, naturally, and quite disturbing in their content. The first claimed the star was cursed and warned of dire consequences should it leave Frostbridge. Subsequent letters grew more specific, threatening that the gem would reclaim its own blood if removed from the manor. Most interesting, and you preserved these letters." "Mr. Lenton insisted upon it. They are in his possession, though I confess I found their melodramatic tone rather theatrical." Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. "Theatrical, perhaps, but effective enough to prompt you to engage my services. Now, the financial pressures that necessitate this sale, they are considerable." A shadow crossed Lady Margaret's aristocratic features. "Modern death duties have been challenging. The estate requires substantial investment, and Felix's recent difficulties have added to our burdens. The star represents our most liquid asset." "Felix's difficulties, these involve gambling debts, I presume?" "Among other things. He's been imprudent, Monsieur Poirot, terribly imprudent." After Lady Margaret departed, Poirot summoned Miss Quayle. The young woman entered with her characteristic quiet efficiency, though I detected an underlying tension in her carefully controlled movements. "Miss Quayle," Poirot began, "you have proven most observant this evening. During those crucial minutes of darkness, you mentioned hearing something distinctive. Please, be precise." She leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes earnest. "Almost immediately after the lights failed, before the general confusion began, I heard a soft metallic sound, like a key turning in a lock. It came from the direction of the display case." "Ah, most significant. And you are certain of the timing?" "Absolutely. It occurred within seconds of the blackout, before people began moving about or calling out." Poirot made a careful note. "Your duties include maintaining household inventories, do they not?" "Yes. I conduct weekly assessments of valuables and ensure all security measures are properly maintained." "Including the ribbon on Lady Margaret's chatelaine key." Miss Quayle colored slightly. "I noticed it had become frayed and replaced it only this afternoon with fresh ribbon from my workbox. I remember because the new shade was slightly brighter than the old." "And where is this workbox kept?" "In the morning room, on the side table by the window." When Miss Quayle departed, Poirot called for Felix Ashworth. The young man entered with an attempt at casual confidence that fooled no one, his handsome features marred by obvious anxiety. "Monsieur Ashworth," Poirot began without preamble, "your financial situation is desperate, is it not?" Felix's carefully constructed facade crumbled instantly. "I've had some unfortunate investments, yes. Nothing that couldn't be resolved by the star's sale. Gambling debts, I believe, rather than investments. Debts to individuals who do not accept delayed payment with good grace." Felix's face went pale. "How did you—" "Yes, all right. I owe money. Substantial sums. But that doesn't make me a murderer. During the blackout, you moved to assist Miss Vale. This required you to pass very close to the display case. I heard Verity's distress and acted instinctively. Any gentleman would have done the same." Poirot's gaze dropped to Felix's right hand, where a thin red line marked his thumb. "You have injured yourself recently, monsieur." Felix glanced down, startled. A paper cut, nothing more. Happened while sorting through some documents earlier. Paper can indeed be treacherous, Poirot observed mildly. You may go. After Felix's departure, Poirot dispatched me to retrieve Miss Quayle's workbox from the morning room. I found it precisely where she had indicated, its contents arranged with meticulous care. Among the items was a spool of blue ribbon, freshly cut, with several inches remaining. Upon my return, I found Mr. Merton waiting outside the study door, his usual composed demeanor showing signs of strain. "Forgive the interruption, sir," he said to Poirot, "but there is something you should know. The paper knife from the escritoire in the long gallery. It is missing. I noticed it when securing the scene. The blade is approximately 6 inches long and quite sharp." Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "When did you last observe this implement in its proper place?" "This morning, sir, when I conducted the daily inspection of the public rooms. It was definitely present then." After dismissing Mr. Merton, Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his fingers steepled before him as he absorbed the implications of this latest revelation. Finally, he turned to me with an expression of grim satisfaction. "The pattern becomes clearer, mon ami. Our murderer is indeed clever, but cleverness without wisdom often leads to overcomplication. They have provided us with too many clues, too many carefully arranged details. The truth, like cream, will rise to the surface despite their efforts to keep it submerged." He rose from his chair with sudden decision. "Come, Hastings. I believe it is time to examine what our departed Mr. Crowther might tell us. Sometimes the dead speak more eloquently than the living, and I suspect he has much to reveal about the true nature of tonight's events." We returned to the long gallery, where the covered form of Mr. Crowther awaited our attention, the scene somehow more ominous in the flickering interplay of electric light and oil lamp flames. Dr. Hawkes remained nearby, maintaining his professional vigil with characteristic dedication. "Doctor," Poirot said quietly, "I should like to examine our unfortunate friend more thoroughly, if you would assist me." Together, they carefully lifted the sheet, revealing the American in all the indignity of violent death. Poirot's examination was methodical and respectful, his small hands moving with practiced precision as he noted details that had escaped our earlier inspection. "The wound is indeed precise," he murmured, studying the dark stain across Crowther's white shirt front. "A single thrust, delivered with considerable force and anatomical knowledge. The angle suggests someone of similar height, or perhaps slightly taller. Our murderer knew exactly where to strike." Dr. Hawkes nodded grimly. "The fingernails are clean, showing no sign of struggle. He was taken completely by surprise." Poirot's attention moved to the dead man's hands with minute care. "Interesting. Upon the palm, traces of furniture wax. Lemon-scented beeswax, the type used on the drawing-room tables. And here," he indicated the brass key, "observe how the blue ribbon is cut with precision, not torn. The knot is neat, deliberate, tied by someone who values order, even in moments of crisis." He examined Crowther's clothing systematically, producing from the waistcoat pocket a thick gold cigar case and from the inner breast pocket a slim leather notebook. The latter contained business-like jottings and, folded neat as a banknote, a sheet of hotel stationery bearing a penciled message. "Long gallery. 10 minutes. Come alone." "Then he was summoned here," I exclaimed. "Perhaps. The handwriting is bold, impatient, and there is a trace of scent upon the paper. Violets, very delicate." Poirot's keen eyes noted every detail. Also, caught in the cuff, a single green thread, very fine. It may be nothing. It may be everything. After examining the shoes, damp from the open doors but showing no compacted snow, Poirot requested access to Crowther's room. Mr. Merton led us to a guest chamber where the American's effects were arranged with methodical precision. Within his locked dispatch case, we discovered documents that painted a troubling picture. A draft, Agreement proposing a private sale of the star at substantially below auction value. Notes in Crowther's hand reading, "Can twist Lenton, Felix eager, Vale useful," and a theatre programme bearing Miss Vale's photograph with an inscription, "To SC, for your star that outshines mine. V." Our American wished to buy privately and cheaply, with pressure applied where necessary, Poirot observed. He was not beloved by those protecting the family's interests. As we prepared to leave, the sound of raised voices drew us back toward the drawing room, where we found Mrs. Carstairs in a state of considerable agitation, pointing accusingly at Mr. Hargrave. "I saw him sneaking about the corridors," she declared, "coming from the direction of the billiard room with something concealed in his jacket." Hargrave's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "I was seeking the lavatory and took a wrong turning." "Perhaps you would empty your pockets, Monsieur Hargrave," Poirot suggested quietly. With obvious reluctance, Hargrave withdrew a handkerchief-wrapped object from his inner jacket. When unfolded, it revealed the missing paper knife, 6 inches of ornate steel with initials R.H. engraved near the hilt. "The murder weapon," Dr. Hawkes confirmed grimly. "I recognized it," Hargrave burst out. "It belonged to my father. When I saw it beside Crowther's body, I panicked, thinking someone was trying to implicate me." Lady Margaret stepped forward. "Your father left several items to the estate in his will. This knife has been part of our collection for 3 years. Poirot examined the blade carefully, noting its scrupulous cleanliness despite its recent deadly use. "Most curious. A weapon used to commit murder, yet meticulously cleaned. Our killer is indeed methodical." He turned to Hargrave with renewed interest. "You found this beside the body, yet when we discovered Mr. Crowther, no weapon was visible. It was partially concealed beneath the Persian rug, as if hastily hidden after the deed." "Ah!" Poirot's exclamation was soft but significant. "Our murderer meant to retrieve it later, but your intervention disrupted their plan. They have been forced to improvise, and improvisation often reveals more than careful planning." He moved to the window, gazing at the relentless snowfall. "No, mes amis, our murderer walks among us. Someone who has played their role with considerable skill, but who has made crucial errors. The little grey cells, they perceive truth through even the most elaborate deception." The ancient windows rattled in their frames, and I realized we were approaching the most dangerous phase of any Poirot investigation, the moment when the killer might be forced to act again. The implications of Poirot's words about our approaching danger settled over the drawing room like a shroud. I watched our fellow guests with new awareness, noting how each face reflected not merely shock or grief, but the particular tension of those who know they are being hunted. The murderer among us had played their hand with considerable skill, but as Poirot had often demonstrated, even the most elaborate deceptions contained the seeds of their own destruction. "The danger I speak of," Poirot continued, his bright eyes moving methodically from face to face, "is that our murderer must now act to preserve their carefully constructed illusion. They have invested too much in this elaborate performance to allow it to crumble under scrutiny." He moved to stand beside the empty display case, his small hands clasped behind his back. "But first, let us consider what we have learned from our departed Mr. Crowther. The good doctor has confirmed that death occurred within the past hour, not during the blackout, but after we discovered the theft. This means our American friend was alive when we gathered around this empty case, alive when we exclaimed over the missing star." Miss Vale shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "But that's impossible. We were all here together." "Were we, mademoiselle? I think if you consider the moments following our discovery, you will recall considerable confusion. People moving about, exclamations of surprise, Miss Quayle departing to investigate the draft from the long gallery. In such circumstances, a clever person might slip away unnoticed." Dr. Hawkes nodded grimly. "The timeline does support this theory. The wound was precise, delivered by someone who knew exactly where to strike. Not the work of a panicked thief, but of someone with anatomical knowledge or extraordinary luck. Poirot's examination of the evidence had revealed details that painted an increasingly complex picture. Upon Mr. Crowther's palm, we found traces of lemon-scented beeswax, the type used exclusively in this drawing room. Yet he died in the long gallery, where lavender wax is used. This tells us he handled something recently polished here before his death. He gestured toward the hearth brush, which lay beside the fireplace. Observe the bristles. They carry the scent of lemon wax mixed with damp charcoal. Someone used this brush to create those convenient footprints in the snow, dabbing it with ash from this very fireplace, and caught in the ferrule 2 blue fibers, silk, very fine, matching the ribbon from Lady Margaret's chatelaine. The psychological pressure was building with each revelation. Felix's hand moved unconsciously to his injured thumb, while Miss Quayle's dark eyes remained fixed on Poirot with an intensity that spoke of more than professional interest. But the most significant discovery, Poirot continued, concerns the key found in Mr. Crowther's hand. You see, this was not the original key from Lady Margaret's chatelaine. Observe the cutting, precise, deliberate, tied with a neat knot. Compare this to the jagged tear on Madame's ribbon, clearly cut in haste during the darkness. Lady Margaret examined her chatelaine with growing understanding. Then someone had prepared a duplicate. Precisely. Someone with access to the original, time to create a replica, and the foresight to plan this elaborate theft. Miss Quayle, you replaced the ribbon on the original key only this afternoon. The timing is most significant. Miss Quayle's composure finally showed signs of strain. I don't understand what you're suggesting. I suggest that someone knew of your intention to replace that ribbon. Someone who had already made their preparations, who needed only to wait for the perfect moment to execute their plan. Poirot moved to examine Crowther's effects once more, producing the folded note from the dead man's pocket. This message, summoning him to the long gallery, bears the faint scent of violets, a delicate perfume, not the jasmine favored by Miss Vale, nor the lavender water preferred by Mrs. Carstairs, and the handwriting, while disguised, shows the careful formation of one accustomed to precise penmanship. The net was tightening, and I could see the effect on our assembled company. Someone among them was fighting to maintain their composure while Poirot systematically dismantled their carefully constructed alibi. The murderer made one crucial error, Poirot announced, his voice taking on the hypnotic quality I'd heard so many times before when he was closing in on his quarry. They assumed we would accept the obvious explanation without question. A greedy American steals the family treasure and is killed by his accomplice, who escapes into the storm. Simple, neat, requiring no uncomfortable examination of those within our closed circle. At that moment, Mr. Merton appeared in the doorway, his usual composure disturbed by obvious urgency. Monsieur Poirot, forgive the interruption, but there has been another development. Someone has been in the wine cellar, several bottles smashed, and the door to the strong room stands ajar. Lady Margaret gasped, her face draining of color. The strong room contains the family papers, insurance documents, and... She stopped abruptly. And what else, madame? Poirot prompted gently. A second key to the display case. I kept it there as security, in case the primary key was ever lost. The silence that followed was profound. Our murderer was still moving through Frostbridge Manor like a ghost, eliminating evidence, preparing for whatever final act their twisted plan required. But they had made another error. Desperation was forcing them into increasingly reckless actions. Poirot's smile held no warmth whatsoever. Excellent. Our murderer grows careless. They seek to retrieve or destroy evidence, but in doing so, they reveal themselves. Come, Hastings. I believe it is time to spring our trap. As we prepared to leave the drawing room, I noticed how the ancient windows rattled in their frames, and the wind seemed to carry with it the promise of revelation. Somewhere in the shadows of Frostbridge Manor, a killer was making their final, desperate moves, and Hercule Poirot was ready to meet them. The wine cellar lay beneath the oldest section of Frostbridge Manor, its ancient stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use and treacherous in the flickering light of Mr. Merton's oil lamp. As we descended into the subterranean chambers, the air grew thick with the mingled scents of aged wine, damp stone, and something else, a metallic tang that spoke of recent disturbance. The vaulted brickwork gleamed faintly with moisture, and our footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space. "The damage is considerable," Mr. Merton reported as we reached the cellar floor, gesturing toward the scene before us. "Several bottles of the finest port were smashed, and the strong-room door stands ajar despite its substantial lock." Indeed, the scene suggested desperate haste rather than methodical searching. Shards of dark glass littered the flagstones, and burgundy wine had pooled in the ancient mortar joints, creating ominous patterns that caught the lamplight like garnets. Yet as Poirot examined the destruction more closely, his expression grew thoughtful. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, kneeling beside the broken glass. "Not the random havoc of a panicked thief, but the selective destruction of someone who wishes to conceal other marks beneath the universal scent of wine. The bottles were chosen deliberately, expensive vintages that would create maximum visual impact while masking footprints, wax drippings, or other telltale signs. The strong room door, a massive oak barrier reinforced with iron bands, showed no signs of forcing despite the substantial lock that should have secured it. Within the chamber, document boxes lay overturned, their contents scattered across the floor in apparent chaos. Yet Poirot's examination revealed a more sinister pattern. Most curious, he observed, sorting through the scattered papers with methodical precision. The documents relating to routine estate business remained largely undisturbed, while those concerning the Star's insurance valuation and auction arrangements have been thoroughly examined. Someone sought very specific information. Among the scattered documents, we discovered correspondence that painted a troubling picture. Letters from various auction houses revealed growing concerns about the Star's provenance, with several prestigious firms declining to handle the sale until certain historical questions could be resolved. Most significantly, these letters were addressed not to Lady Margaret, but to Mr. Lenton in his capacity as family solicitor. "It appears our good solicitor has been conducting negotiations without fully informing his client," Poirot noted grimly. "Recent research has raised questions about how the Star was originally acquired during the colonial period. Such complications would severely impact its market value and bring unwanted scrutiny to the family." The missing second key from its hook inside the strong room confirmed our murderer's continued activity. But it was Poirot's discovery beneath the wine racks that proved most illuminating. Wrapped in a wine-stained velvet pouch, he retrieved the diamond collar that had once framed the Frostbridge star. The great sapphire was gone, but the setting remained, its interior prongs bent and smeared with a pale residue. "Household wax," Poirot observed, examining the substance with his pocket glass. "Not jeweler's cement." Our murderer worked quickly and crudely, pressing the stone into wax to carry it unseen while discarding the too recognizable collar. The Star is indeed still within these walls. As we prepared to leave the cellar, the sound of stealthy footsteps from above caught our attention. Poirot extinguished his lamp immediately, plunging us into darkness save for Mr. Merton's carefully shielded lantern. The footsteps paused at the cellar entrance, testing the door before retreating with obvious urgency towards the main staircase. "Our murderer grows increasingly desperate," Poirot whispered as we emerged from the cellar. "Each action to eliminate evidence reveals more of their identity. They are trapped by their own cleverness." Returning to the drawing room, we found the assembled company in a state of barely controlled tension. Felix stood by the window, his knuckles white as he gripped the frame while staring out at the relentless snowfall. Miss Vale had positioned herself near the fire, her dramatic beauty enhanced by the flickering light, though I noticed her hands trembled as she adjusted her evening gloves. Miss Quayle sat with Lady Margaret, ostensibly reviewing household accounts, but her dark eyes frequently assessed the other occupants with sharp intelligence. "I trust your examination proved illuminating," Mr. Lenton inquired as we entered, his tone carefully neutral despite the anxiety evident in his pale eyes. "Most illuminating indeed," Poirot replied, settling into his chair with the precision of a chess master preparing his final moves. He produced the diamond collar from his pocket, placing it deliberately upon the table where the star's display case had stood. The effect was immediate and revealing. Felix made an involuntary movement toward his breast pocket before forcing his hand away, while Miss Quayle's careful composure showed the first signs of genuine strain. "The stone has been removed from its setting," Poirot announced, his bright eyes moving methodically from face to face. "It remains here, somewhere within these walls, carried by someone who believed they could outsmart both the storm and the forces of justice. But desperation leads to mistakes, and mistakes, mes amis, lead inevitably to truth." Lady Margaret's aristocratic features reflected both apprehension and determination as she absorbed the implications. "Then we are indeed trapped here with a murderer who grows more dangerous with each passing hour." "Precisely, madame, which is why I must now ask each of you to remain together while I conduct a final examination of the premises. Our killer has made several crucial errors in their haste to eliminate evidence. The little gray cells perceive patterns even in apparent chaos. Those patterns will soon reveal the identity of the person who valued family secrets more than human life." The ancient manor seemed to hold its breath as Poirot prepared for his final gambit. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but within these walls, a different kind of tempest was building toward its inevitable climax. Someone among us had committed what they believed to be the perfect crime, but perfection, as Poirot had often demonstrated, was merely an illusion waiting to be shattered by the inexorable logic of truth. Poirot's systematic examination of Frostbridge Manor began with the methodical precision that had made him legendary among the criminal classes of Europe. With the guests confined to the drawing room under Colonel Langford's watchful eye, we moved through the ancient corridors like hunters tracking dangerous prey. The storm continued its relentless assault on the windows, but within these walls, a different kind of tempest was building toward its inevitable climax. "We begin with the morning room, mon ami," Poirot announced as we entered the chamber where Miss Quayle kept her work box. "Always it is the small details that reveal the greatest truths, and here we shall find evidence of preparation that extends far beyond tonight's events." His examination of the workbox proved immediately fruitful. The remaining spool of blue ribbon showed clear signs of recent cutting, but more significantly, the small silver thimble nestled among the sewing implements bore a tiny indentation on its side and, clinging to its inner rim, an almost invisible fragment of pale blue. Poirot held it to the lamplight with evident satisfaction. "Observe, Hastings. This thimble has been used not for sewing, but for pressing something hard into a malleable substance. The blue fragment confirms our suspicions. Someone used this implement to create an impression of the star itself." Moving to the side table, Poirot's keen eyes detected what we had missed earlier. Beneath the table's edge, pressed into the ancient wood, was a small cavity filled with hardened wax. Within this crude mold, blue silk threads clung to the cooled substance, and the unmistakable scent of lemon beeswax filled the air. "A temporary hiding place," he murmured, carefully extracting the wax impression. "See how the threads match those from the false key's ribbon?" Our murderer worked quickly but methodically, creating this mold to hold the star while they prepared their more elaborate deception. The implications were staggering. Someone had planned this theft with meticulous care, preparing hiding places and false evidence well in advance of the evening's events. But as we prepared to leave the morning room, the soft sound of approaching footsteps caused Poirot to extinguish the lamp immediately. Through a crack in the door, we watched as a slim figure entered the room with practiced stealth. The intruder moved directly to the side table, searching frantically for something that was no longer there. When their hand found only empty space where the wax mold had been hidden, a soft exclamation of distress escaped their lips. The figure then moved to the workbox, examining its contents with growing desperation before departing as silently as they had arrived. "Our murderer grows careless," Poirot observed as we emerged from concealment. "Desperation forces them to take increasingly dangerous risks, and each risk reveals more of their identity." Returning to the drawing room, Poirot positioned himself once again beside the empty display case, his demeanor suggesting a man preparing to deliver a fatal blow to his opponent's carefully constructed defenses. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the hypnotic quality that marked his most dramatic revelations, "the evidence we have discovered tonight reveals a crime far more complex than simple theft. The Frostbridge star was not stolen by Mr. Crowther or any mysterious accomplice. It was taken by someone who understood that its legitimate sale had become impossible due to recent scholarly investigations into its provenance." Lady Margaret's face grew pale, but Poirot continued relentlessly. "The correspondence discovered in your strong room, madame, reveals that several prestigious auction houses have declined to handle the star's sale pending resolution of historical questions about how your ancestor acquired it during his service with the East India Company. Such complications would render the gem virtually unsaleable through legitimate channels." Felix shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hand moving unconsciously toward his breast pocket before he forced it away. "What are you suggesting, Monsieur Poirot?" "I am suggesting that someone facing immediate financial pressures realized that an insurance claim would provide immediate relief without the complications of a disputed auction. The star's theft, apparently by outside criminals who murdered their accomplice before escaping into the storm, would trigger full payment without uncomfortable questions about colonial-era acquisitions." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the persistent howl of wind around the manor's ancient stones. Miss Quayle's dark eyes remained fixed on Poirot with an intensity that suggested more than professional interest, while Dr. Hawkes leaned forward with the fascination of one witnessing a master craftsman at work. "But insurance investigators are not fools," Mrs. Carstairs protested. "Surely they would discover such deception." "Not if the physical evidence supported the story completely. The false footprints in the snow created with ash from this very fireplace. The planted key in the dead man's hand, cut from ribbon identical to that on Lady Margaret's chatelaine. The murder weapon, cleaned with medical precision to remove all traces of its true user. Every detail was calculated to support the narrative of outside criminals and tragic coincidence." Poirot moved to the French doors, examining once more the melted snow patterns on the parquet floor. But our murderer made crucial errors born of their very thoroughness. They assumed we would accept the obvious explanation without deeper investigation. They counted on our prejudices about greedy Americans and mysterious accomplices to blind us to the more complex reality. At that moment, the lights failed once again, plunging us into the same complete darkness that had marked the evening's beginning. But this time, the darkness brought with it a different quality of menace, the sense of a predator moving through familiar territory toward some predetermined goal. A woman's gasp echoed through the blackness, followed by the sound of a brief struggle near the doorway. When Mr. Merton's emergency lamps finally restored illumination, we discovered Miss Quayle pressed against the wall, her face white with shock, while Felix knelt beside her with obvious concern. "Someone tried to force something into my hand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They whispered that I should keep silent about what I've seen, or face the same fate as Mr. Crowther." Poirot's expression had grown grim as he absorbed this latest development. The murderer was indeed growing desperate, willing to risk exposure for the chance to eliminate a potential witness. But in doing so, they had revealed more about their identity and intentions than any amount of careful investigation might have uncovered. "The endgame approaches," he announced quietly, his bright eyes reflecting the firelight like twin flames. "Our murderer has shown their hand, and in doing so, they have sealed their own fate. The little grey cells perceive the pattern now, and tomorrow, when the storm passes and we can no longer be isolated with our secrets, the truth will emerge as inevitably as dawn follows the darkest night. The ancient manor seemed to hold its breath as Poirot prepared for his final gambit, and I realized that before another day passed, the Frostbridge star would either be recovered or its theft would claim yet another victim in this deadly game of deception and desperation. The threat against Miss Quayle had revealed our murderer's growing desperation, but it also provided Poirot with the final piece of evidence he required. As the young woman recovered her composure with admirable fortitude, I watched my friend's expression transform from methodical investigation to the focused intensity of a chess master preparing his final gambit. The attempt to intimidate Miss Quayle confirms what the physical evidence has already told us, Poirot announced, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. Our murderer fears not what she knows, but what she observed during those crucial moments of confusion. Someone among us has been moving through this house with intimate knowledge of its layout, its secrets, and most importantly, its financial vulnerabilities. He moved to stand before the assembled company, his small hands clasped behind his back in the familiar gesture that marked his most significant revelations. Mr. Crowther's notebook reveals that he had discovered the true nature of tonight's events. His businessman's instincts detected what we ourselves observed, that the ribbon on the false key was brighter, fresher than the faded original on Lady Margaret's chatelaine. He realized he was witnessing not a spontaneous theft, but a carefully planned insurance fraud. The implications hung heavy in the air like smoke from the dying fire. Felix's face had grown increasingly pale during this recitation, while Miss Quayle's dark eyes remained fixed on Poirot with an intensity that suggested she understood more than she had yet revealed. But understanding the motive is only half the equation. Poirot continued, "We must also recover the star itself, which I assure you remains within these walls. The murderer has hidden it with considerable cleverness, but cleverness has its own weaknesses." He gestured toward Mr. Merton, who had been waiting in the doorway. "Please ensure that all fires throughout the house are built to their maximum intensity. Every fireplace, every brazier, every source of heat must burn as hot as possible, and bring every candle from the household stores to this room." As the butler departed to execute these mysterious instructions, Poirot turned back to our bewildered company. "You see, mes amis, the star has been concealed within a substance that seemed permanent, but is, in fact, quite vulnerable to temperature. Beeswax, when heated sufficiently, becomes malleable, unreliable. Our murderer chose this hiding method for its temporary convenience, not realizing it would become their downfall. The effect of this announcement was immediate and revealing. While most of the company showed only confusion, I noticed one person whose face reflected not bewilderment, but barely concealed alarm. The knowledge that their carefully chosen hiding place was about to betray them had clearly disrupted our murderer's composure. Within an hour, Frostbridge Manor had been transformed into a furnace. Every fireplace roared with carefully tended flames, and the drawing room blazed with dozens of candles arranged upon the sideboard. The temperature rose steadily, and with it, the psychological pressure upon our assembled suspects. "Now we wait," Poirot announced with evident satisfaction. "The heat will do our work for us. Somewhere in this house, wax is beginning to soften, and our murderer knows they must act before their treasure becomes visible to casual observation." As if summoned by his words, the lights failed once again. But this time, Poirot was prepared. In the sudden darkness, I heard his whispered instruction, "Follow, but silently." We moved through the familiar corridors by feel and memory, guided by the faint glow of the abundant fires that now illuminated the house. In the morning room, we positioned ourselves in the shadows as a slim figure entered with practiced stealth. The intruder moved directly to the side table, searching frantically beneath its edge where we had earlier discovered the wax mold. When their hand found only empty space, a soft exclamation of distress escaped their lips. The figure then moved to examine the table's surface more closely, and in the flickering firelight, I saw them extract a small object from their clothing, something pale and waxy that had begun to soften in the heat. As they attempted to reshape it with trembling fingers, Poirot stepped from the shadows. "I would not trouble yourself further," he said quietly. "The Frostbridge star has endured far worse conditions than a warm evening, and it will survive your amateur attempts at concealment." The figure spun toward us, and in the firelight I finally saw the face of our murderer clearly revealed. It was someone whose intimate knowledge of the house, access to family papers, and understanding of the star's problematic provenance had made this elaborate deception possible. Someone whose financial desperation had transformed careful planning into deadly action. "You cannot prove anything," came the whispered response, but the voice carried the hollow ring of defeat. "On the contrary," Poirot replied, producing his pocket torch to illuminate the softened wax in the murderer's hands. "The star itself will provide all the proof required, and when Inspector Bradshaw arrives in the morning with his forensic specialists, they will find traces of your fingerprints on the murder weapon, despite your medical precision in cleaning it. They will match the violet scent on the note that lured Mr. Crowther to his death. They will analyze the green silk fibers caught on his clothing and connect them to your evening dress." The ancient manor seemed to hold its breath as our murderer finally understood that their elaborate construction of lies and misdirection had crumbled beyond repair. The game, as Poirot would have said, was indeed over. "Come," he said gently, extending his hand toward the softened wax that contained the star. "Let us return this treasure to its proper place, and then we shall discuss how you came to believe that murder was preferable to honesty about your desperate circumstances." As we prepared to return to the drawing room for Poirot's final revelation, I realized that the most dangerous part of our ordeal was finally drawing to a close. The storm outside continued its assault on Frostbridge Manor's ancient stones, but within these walls, the tempest of deception and murder was about to give way to the calm that always followed the triumph of Hercule Poirot's remarkable mind. The drawing room received us with the oppressive warmth that now permeated every corner of Frostbridge Manor, the abundant fires having transformed the ancient chambers into a furnace that served Poirot's purposes admirably. Miss Quayle walked beside us with the resigned dignity of one who had finally abandoned all pretense, her pale hands cradling the softened wax that had so recently concealed the Frostbridge star. The assembled company looked up with expressions ranging from bewilderment to dawning comprehension as we took our positions before the empty display case. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot announced, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty, "the moment has arrived to reveal not merely the identity of our murderer, but the complex web of love, desperation, and misguided loyalty that transformed careful planning into deadly action." He gestured toward Miss Quayle, who stood with remarkable composure despite the tears that had begun to trace silent paths down her cheeks. "Miss Lydia Quayle has been far more than Lady Margaret's companion and secretary. She has been the architect of an elaborate deception designed to save the Ashworth family from financial ruin, even at the cost of her own soul." Lady Margaret's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence. Felix half rose from his chair, his face reflecting a mixture of shock and something that might have been recognition. "The evidence tells us a story of meticulous planning born from intimate knowledge," Poirot continued, his bright eyes moving methodically around the room. Miss Quayle alone had access to the family correspondence that revealed the star's fatal flaw. Recent historical research had raised uncomfortable questions about its colonial-era acquisition. These complications would have rendered it virtually worthless at legitimate auction, while insurance fraud would provide immediate relief without such scrutiny. Miss Quayle's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the steady tone of one who had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind. "Lady Margaret trusted me with everything, the household accounts, the family papers, the true extent of our financial difficulties. I couldn't bear to watch her lose Frostbridge Manor for nothing. Couldn't see Felix destroy himself with gambling debts, while she sacrificed her most precious possession to no purpose. And so you devised an alternative, Poirot observed, with unexpected gentleness. An insurance claim following theft by mysterious criminals would solve everything, but such a claim required convincing physical evidence, evidence you were uniquely positioned to create. He moved to examine the softened wax in her hands, from which the magnificent sapphire now gleamed with undiminished fire. The fresh ribbon you had placed on Lady Margaret's chatelaine this very afternoon provided the perfect opportunity. You created a duplicate key, knowing that Mr. Crowther's sharp businessmen's instincts would detect the deception and force your hand. Dr. Hawkes leaned forward with professional interest. The precision of the wound suggested medical knowledge. You trained as a nurse, Miss Quayle? During the war, she confirmed quietly. I learned anatomy from necessity, treating wounded soldiers when qualified personnel were unavailable. That knowledge served me well tonight, though I take no pride in its application. Poirot's reconstruction continued with relentless precision. During the blackout, you opened the case with your duplicate key. Miss Quayle heard that distinctive metallic sound immediately. You removed the star and pressed it into the wax mold you had prepared beneath the morning room table, using your own thimble to create a perfect impression. The diamond collar, too recognizable, you discarded in the wine cellar during your later attempts to eliminate evidence. Felix found his voice at last. Lydia, you did all this for us. For me? I did it because I love this family more than my own life, she replied, her composure finally cracking. Lady Margaret has shown me more kindness than my own mother ever did. You've been everything I could never hope to deserve. When I saw what your debts were doing to you both, I couldn't stand by and watch. But Mr. Crowther complicated your careful plan. Poirot continued inexorably. His business acumen detected the fresh ribbon on your duplicate key, perhaps even observed your movements during the confusion. When he confronted you in the long gallery, threatening to expose not just the theft, but the family's desperate circumstances, you realized your elaborate deception was about to crumble. Miss Quayle's tears flowed freely now. He was going to destroy everything, not just expose the fraud, but use our desperation to acquire the star at a fraction of its value. He saw opportunity in our misery, and I couldn't allow that. The paper knife from the long gallery provided your weapon, Poirot observed. Your medical training ensured the wound was precise and instantly fatal. Then, with methodical care, you cleaned the blade, created false footprints in the snow with ash from the drawing-room fireplace, and staged the scene to suggest outside criminals. Lady Margaret rose with the dignity that had sustained her through decades of social obligation, moving to place a gentle hand on Miss Quayle's shoulder. My dear child, if you had only confided in me, we could have found another way. There was no other way, Miss Quayle whispered. The estate is mortgaged beyond redemption. Felix owes money to people who don't accept delayed payment gracefully. The star was our only hope, and it had become worthless because of those historical complications. Poirot carefully extracted the Frostbridge star from its waxy prison, holding it up to catch the firelight. Even after its ordeal, the sapphire blazed with undiminished beauty, its deep blue depths seeming to contain all the mysteries of the ancient world. The tragedy, he observed quietly, is that your plan was indeed brilliant. The physical evidence was convincing, the motive appeared clear, and the storm provided perfect isolation for your elaborate performance. But you underestimated the persistence of truth and the power of human observation to penetrate even the most carefully constructed deceptions. As the ancient clock chimed midnight, marking the end of this extraordinary evening, Miss Quayle straightened her shoulders with something approaching her old composure. I regret Mr. Crowther's death more than I can express, but I cannot regret trying to save the people I love, even if my methods were inexcusable. The storm outside was finally beginning to abate, its fury spent against Frostbridge Manor's ancient stones. Soon, Inspector Bradshaw would arrive with the dawn, and the formal machinery of justice would claim its due. But in the flickering light of the drawing-room fire, surrounded by the portraits of long-dead Ashworths, whose painted eyes seemed to watch with eternal patience, we had witnessed something far more complex than simple murder and theft. Human nature, Poirot reflected as he gently returned the star to its proper place within the display case, is the most intricate mystery of all. Love and desperation can drive even the most decent souls to unthinkable acts. Yet truth, mes amis, remains constant, patient, persistent, and ultimately triumphant over even the most elaborate deceptions. The little Belgian detective adjusted his moustaches with characteristic precision, his bright eyes reflecting the firelight as he contemplated the eternal struggle between justice and human frailty that had once again played out within these ancient walls. The grey dawn light filtering through Frostbridge Manor's ancient windows found our company assembled once more in the drawing-room, though the atmosphere had transformed completely from the evening's tension and mystery. The storm had finally exhausted itself against the Yorkshire countryside, leaving behind a crystalline landscape that sparkled under the pale winter sun. Miss Quayle sat with remarkable composure beside Lady Margaret, their hands clasped in a gesture that spoke of forgiveness, transcending betrayal, while the Frostbridge star rested once again in its proper place, catching the morning light and transforming it into something deeper and more mysterious. The sound of motor cars crunching through the snow announced Inspector Bradshaw's arrival, his practical Yorkshire manner providing welcome relief from the psychological intensity that had permeated our investigation. His weathered face reflected both professional satisfaction and genuine sympathy as he absorbed Poirot's methodical recounting of the night's events, supported by the carefully preserved evidence that told its own irrefutable story. "I must say, Monsieur Poirot," Inspector Bradshaw observed as he reviewed the organized documentation, "this represents one of the most complex cases of insurance fraud I've encountered. The attention to detail was remarkable. Without your intervention, we might well have accepted the story of outside criminals and mysterious accomplices." Poirot inclined his head graciously, though his expression remained grave. "The tragedy, Inspector, lies not in the complexity of the deception, but in its motivation. Miss Quayle's actions were born from love and desperation rather than simple greed, a distinction that makes them comprehensible, though no less criminal." Miss Quayle's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the steady dignity that had sustained her through years of devoted service. "I accept full responsibility for my actions, Inspector. Mr. Crowther's death weighs heavily upon my conscience, but I cannot regret attempting to save the people I love, even through inexcusable methods." Felix stepped forward, his face reflecting a maturity that the night's revelations had forced upon him. "Lydia, you must understand. I would rather have lost everything than see you destroy yourself for my mistakes. The gambling debts, the financial pressures, they were my burden to bear, not yours." "Love recognizes no such boundaries," she replied quietly. "I watched you grow desperate and reckless, saw what those debts were doing to both you and Lady Margaret, and I couldn't bear to stand by helplessly while you suffered." Lady Margaret's aristocratic composure remained intact as she addressed the inspector. "Miss Quayle's loyalty has been absolute, but loyalty without wisdom becomes its own form of tragedy. Had she confided in me about the true extent of our difficulties, we might have found solutions that didn't require such desperate measures." As the formal proceedings continued, Inspector Bradshaw confirmed that charges would be filed: murder in the first degree, insurance fraud, and theft, though he acknowledged that the circumstances would likely influence the court's consideration of appropriate sentencing. The question of the Frostbridge star's ultimate fate required immediate resolution. Lady Margaret's decision reflected the principled character that had sustained her family through generations of responsibility. "The star will remain at Frostbridge Manor," she announced with quiet authority. not because we cannot bear to part with it, but because its sale would forever be tainted by the tragedy that has surrounded it. We shall find other ways to address our financial difficulties, ways that honor both our heritage and our obligations to those who depend upon us. Felix's transformation was evident as he addressed his aunt with newfound resolve. I've contacted my creditors and arranged payment schedules that don't require the Star's sale. It will take time and honest work, but I intend to honor every debt without further family sacrifice. As Miss Quayle was led away with dignity intact despite her circumstances, Poirot drew me aside to the window overlooking the snow-covered Yorkshire countryside. The landscape stretched away in pristine beauty that seemed to mock the human tragedy we had witnessed within these ancient walls. "Tell me, Hastings," he said thoughtfully, "what do you make of this affair? Have we witnessed justice or merely the triumph of circumstance over human frailty?" I considered his question carefully, watching the departure of our tragic protagonist. "I believe we've seen something more complex than simple justice, my friend. Miss Quayle committed terrible crimes, but her motives were rooted in love rather than malice. That doesn't excuse her actions, but it makes them comprehensible in ways that mere greed never could." Poirot nodded approvingly. "Precisely so. The human heart is capable of both sublime devotion and terrible destruction, sometimes simultaneously. Miss Quayle's love for this family was genuine and absolute, but it blinded her to alternatives that might have achieved her goals without such tragic consequences." As we prepared for our departure, Lady Margaret approached with the composed dignity that had sustained her through the night's revelations. "Monsieur Poirot, I cannot adequately express my gratitude. Without your remarkable abilities, an innocent person might have been charged while the true perpetrator escaped justice." "Madame," Poirot replied with characteristic precision, "truth has its own momentum. It would have emerged eventually, though perhaps not without additional tragedy. I'm merely grateful we could prevent further loss of life." The ancient manor, which had seemed so ominous in the storm's fury, now appeared peaceful under the morning sun, its grey stones softened by snow and its windows reflecting the pale light with gentle warmth. As our motorcar crunched through the snow toward the main road, Poirot made one final observation that would remain with me long after the case had faded into memory. "The Frostbridge star will continue to shine, mon ami, but its light will forever be refracted through the prism of human tragedy. Perhaps that is fitting. Beauty without understanding of its cost is merely decoration, while beauty that acknowledges the full price of its existence becomes something approaching wisdom." The case was closed, but its lessons about the intricate relationship between love, desperation, and moral choice would endure long after the Yorkshire snows had melted and spring had returned to the ancient manor's gardens.